Good afternoon. We are glad to see you all back in your seats after a great lunch, we hope. And we have a terrific afternoon planned. I have just one announcement at the moment, and that is if you wish to share your name and email address with all of the participants here at the conference, we will be sending around a pad of paper on which you can write your name and email address. So if you want to participate, give us your email address. And now I want to introduce my esteemed colleague, Gary Sandling, who is the head here at Monticello of Education and Visitor Programs. Thank you.
Good afternoon. We have the, as I think was observed yesterday after lunch, we have that unenviable position being right after the meal. Hopefully you got some fresh air, had a chance to walk around a little bit, and we promise to provide, I promise that the panelists will provide some interesting perspective and comment on the question of, or the case studies about the recreation, reconstructing, and representing of slave dwellings and workspaces. So in thinking about this larger question for the session about the consumption, as it was termed, of slavery research, who decides? I think anyone in the room who has any experience with, as an advisor, a consultant, a program planner, an interpreter, or a visitor to a historic site, you probably know that where the rubber hits the road on these questions is often when you, in a public setting, are talking about a potentially controversial topic with people who have come either ready to hit that topic head on or are entirely unaware of the controversy of that topic. And certainly in many historic sites, none more so than the interpretation of slavery. And an integral part of that interpretation is, of course, what one exhibits. So if you think about the landscape and environment of your historic site as being part of that which people experience, there are few things that are more intimate, more connected to a human story than a building where people lived. And to see that represented in some fashion. But we also know that it poses significant challenges in terms of how we do that with rigorous rigorous analysis of the evidence we have at hand. So this panel is going to represent a kind of spectrum of points of view about how one should do this, how it can be approached, what the advantages and disadvantages are, using some case studies to talk very specifically about how and where those decisions were made. And I would suggest to you, we've heard, there's some terms that I've listened to very carefully in the sessions and in conversations up to this point that I think I would suggest are important. I've heard the term authentic and authenticity with a capital A used on many occasions. I've also heard the word truth with a capital T used on many occasions. And I think this panel's perspective and your comments and questions to them will really hit square on maybe the intersection of those two ideas and many others. So without further ado, let me introduce to you briefly the panel and a little something about the format. And starting to the far left from your vantage point, let me introduce our panelists. Ed Chappell, who is the Director of Architectural Research at Colonial Williamsburg. Sarah Bon-Harper, who is the Executive Director at Ashlawn Highland, which you can see from here, actually back this way. Just a couple of miles down the road, and formerly a colleague of ours in the archaeology department here at Monticello. I'm delighted Sarah is in her role, but I miss her, so I'll just say that now. Matt Reeves, who's the Director of Archaeology at James Madison's Montpelier. And Frank Sanchez, the third, Director of United States Programs for the World Monument Fund. And they'll all tell you a little bit more maybe about, of course, their experiences and projects and perspectives in turn. So we also have some visuals to show you to help illustrate maybe some of these points. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Ed.
What I thought I would do is talk about a couple of sites that Colonial Williamsburg has enriched or developed or presented over the last 20 or 30 years. And this is part of a larger group. There's also a site called Great Hopes, and some of my colleagues from Colonial Williamsburg are here today who can speak about those as well, depending on your questions. But I thought I would just talk a little bit and show you a few images of the slave quarter at Curtis Grove and the Peyton Randolph site. The excavation, the archaeology at Curtis Grove was done in the era of stratigraphic exploration, but relatively early in the archaeological study of sites associated primarily with enslaved people. And so what were found there primarily were a pretty generous group of what Fraser rightly or nicely calls subfloor pits, sometimes called storage cellars. And so those were the principal features left at the site. There's a lot one could learn from the topography, the distance from the very large, costly 1750s principal house, really a number of things. But essentially what we had were these subfloor pits. And so I think one point I should make is that the evidence was not terribly rich. It was much less rich than exists for Mulberry Road, for example. However, we thought it was rich enough, we thought it was clear enough to make some decisions about how to present slavery, race relations, and the lives of the enslaved people at Curtis Grove. So in some ways, it was kind of experimental archaeology, if you will, trying to flesh out the bare bones of what was learned from the excavation of these pits. There was some sort of silly early debate, but that it's funny how you can look back on debates that seem so silly now, but that were central to our lives at the time. And one of the arguments was that we didn't know enough about this particular quarter to present it on the same site, that in fact we should present it a fresh site at Curtis Grove so that people wouldn't get the mistaken idea that we knew more than we did. To me, this was a ridiculous argument. Frankly, and happily, Colonial Williamsburg decided to use the real site. So I think that was terribly important to us. So we looked at this as what we thought was a home farm quarter. So it's close enough to the main house that some people who did domestic work, did work in the main house, may have lived at this quarter, but we think it was primarily for people who were agricultural workers. It was one of the earliest, not the first, but one of the earliest groups of buildings that we did using all 18th century or virtually all period construction techniques. And so we sorted out what we thought these houses looked like in terms of their size, position, relationship to one another, number of rooms, and then we recreated those, if you will, using 18th century techniques. And a lot of this was based on field work. We really looked very closely at the written record, but we did lots of pretty vigorous field work in the Chesapeake countryside and sometimes beyond. And one of the things that we struggled with some was we knew that as vigorously as we pursued the field work, that much of what we were recording and studying were later buildings of the late antebellum period. And so in some ways sort of the dangerous process of sometimes kind of trying to project back to an earlier era what things look like based on later conditions which you know are new and changed and different. But I think the written record and the archaeological record allowed us to put into perspective what we were learning in the countryside. I thought because of that this site would be controversial, and I think I thought of it as being controversial in a kind of small-minded way, that people would say, well, how do you know the roof is like that? You know, how do you know the size of this little room at the, you know, front right corner? How do you know these questions? You know, how do you know those two pits were open at the same time and not the third one? How do you know these detailed questions about the material lives of the group of 25 or so people who live there? And in fact, what I found, with a few exceptions, was nobody asked that. Nobody cared whether we got it exactly right. You know, is the pitch of the roof right? Nobody cared, you know. I don't remember ever being asked about the pitch of the roof or the exposure of the eaves. What people really wanted to know was, is this the place? You know, and I thought about it in kind of abstracted, intellectualized white, you know, architectural historians terms. I mean, it was important to me emotionally, as a guy who grew up in a totally racist, segregated Southern Virginia town. This meant a lot to me that my institution do this, but I hadn't thought what the questions would be, and those were, did people really live here? Was this the real spot? Is this where it happened? And the answer was yes, happily. We presented Carter's Grove in there are a couple of methodologies that we employed. Let me say, I do think it was a pretty evocative place. I think that one could really go there, a visitor could go there and really be immersed in questions about forced labor and the lives of the people who live there. I think it was very evocative in that regard. The way that it was presented kind of falls into two categories, I think. One is first person and the other is third person. And so there were some very powerful scenes presented there. Christy talked about, she may not have mentioned Carter's Grove, but the kinds of acted scenes that she referred to were employed here. And often it was a much smaller group of interpreters, but who were in period costume and in first person. And the alternative was third person interpretation, and in that case, the interpreters were not wearing 18th century costumes. And I think this is a distinction that probably we didn't really craft, but it was one that I remember Jim Dietz saying, you know, in this kind of offhand way that he could say intelligent things, was that if they're not in first period, it's ridiculous. You know, it's silly for someone to wear farthingales, but, you know, speak from a 21st century standpoint. And so we drew that distinction, and I think it was very important for the staff as well as for the visitors. I should say that even when we had Carter's Grove and the slave floater was open to the public, Colonial Williamsburg's principal focus was, of course, the 18th century town. And so one must really ask, well, how well did we do there? Maybe you did a great job 11 miles away, but to some degree is that a kind of ghettoizing of the story? And so we're not kind of in response to that, but at the same time, we both were actively engaged in African American presentations and beginning to try to integrate those presentations into many sites. And so one site I thought I'd talk about. The second one is the Peyton Randolph property. This is, and it's interesting, it's kind of preservation, restoration, reconstruction terms. Could refer to a little more about that later, but began with the original house. You see at the lower left corner that 3-room plus stair hall space was built in 1717 by William Robertson. It was a kind of gentry level house that was rented to tenants. So that survived. And it was enlarged in about 1754 to 55. Peyton Randolph, a third owner, made it a proper Georgian house, representing sort of advance in the sort of extent of gentry housemaking. So what Peyton Randolph did was to create a big 7-bay facade facing Market Square, creating a big stair passage with a grand church-like window lighting it, a very fancy dining room with a marble mantel and walnut woodwork, and then a superior bedchamber with 3 closets upstairs. So he turned this old tenanted gentry house of the early 18th century into a proper mid-18th century edifice, for which I push the right button, you'll see, here's the back. And so this survived, 90%, 93% intact, much of its woodwork, almost all its interior woodwork, its house frame, much of the exterior fabric survived relatively intact. What didn't survive was a mid-18th century tenement to the right, and not seen, well, to the left in your view, and a large group of ancillary buildings that, beginning in about 1755, included Peyton Randolph's kitchen, laundry, quarter, which is a term that was used after his death to characterize the building. So if you will, this original site, but unlike the slave port at Carter's Grove, it had this substantial, quote, original standing, surviving, more or less intact edifice. It was an edifice in which enslaved black people lived as well as wealthy whites. But there was pretty rich and complex evidence for the rest of that world in the rear yard. And it was made more complex by the fact that it was excavated largely in the 1930s. So most of the stratigraphy was destroyed. And so very complex for us to try to sort out, without its associated stratigraphy, some pieces of earlier buildings, tenements, and kitchens got incorporated into subsequent rebuildings. And so part of our job was to sort out these pieces, which we did doing new archaeology and using things like mortar analysis and brick analysis. So we had a pretty intact footprint of what we thought was there. It is in some ways much like a more urban arrangement that one would see in Charleston in the late colonial period, or Jamaican cities with a main house and then more or less attached by a covered way, in some cases, the sort of long ancillary building that draws together housing for enslaved workers and cooking, laundrying, and processes of the like. So we sorted this out. We decided we were going to reconstruct this as well as other outbuildings in the town. And so we went about it in a very colonial Williamsburg kind of way. We tried to get it right, try to get the details right. And I mean, I think one thing that's interesting with any sort of project like this is there's some things you know a lot about, and there are other things that you don't. or there are things you know a lot less about. So, for example, we knew that there's a vaulted cellar used for storage of foodstuffs, and part of that vault survived, and from the surviving parts of the vault, we could see that the centering to build the vault had been built of a wooden frame, and ribbon clapboards of a certain width and length had been laid over that frame, and then the masons had laid the vault over that, and then the frame had been taken out. So we did that. We built centering, we rived the clapboards, took a lot of crumbling and effort, but we rived the clapboards and we laid the bricks. Here you see Ray Canetti, the best mason on the East Coast alive, laying that vault so that the little ridges that you see if you go into that cellar follow the precise character of what that arch looked like in the 18th century. So you have these wonderful little detail glimpses, but then there are many things you don't know. And I should say, I'm not sure we usually say this publicly, but I'll say that, for example, Willie Graham and I had a big argument over, was this building really a full 2 stories high or a story and a half? There's a pretty good photo of it taken about the 1880s that showed a piece of the building and showed it as 2 full stories. But you could argue, did it get raised in the 1840s or 50s to this? I think ultimately put together a really good argument that it was 2 stories. But in fact, you don't really know. And so I think one thing to confront at a historic site that recreates pieces is you're never going to know every answer. You'll never know everything that one might like to know to do the thing. So this, again, we did using 18th century building techniques. We cut the trees in the woods, we hauled them out, we hewed them with axes and adzes, we pit sawed the planks, and we raised them. It was probably the most public, and to me it seemed most dangerous public raising we ever did. The most dangerous thing we ever did politically probably was Christie's sale, but probably the most physically dangerous thing we did was to let 200 visitors help us pull these walls up. Yeah, and so the building was created in the way that Colonial Williamsburg and a number of museums now do, is to make the restoration or the reconstruction part of the exhibition, so that hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, come and see the process as well as the product. So outwardly, here's the shell of that that other half, if you will, of the Peyton Randolph complex. It's remarkable that it almost has as many square feet as the main house, connected by an umbilical cord that that served as a connection, a little bit, a kind of above ground version of Thomas Jefferson's semi-subterranean umbilical cord that brought service to the house. I think one thing that we were able to do here and are able to do is to speak somewhat more explicitly about the lives of the people who lived in this building, lived in both buildings and worked there. We have a list. We know the names of everyone who was on site after Peyton Randolph's death. We know something about their lives. We know that Eve, for example, did go to the enemy, as Betty Randolph wrote in her list. She listed the enslaved people, and next to Eve, she said, "Gone to the enemy." And so one of the things that we do is now, as the visitor makes their way through the main house and then out into the slave quarter, is to tell the story of particular people whose names we know, who lived in these spaces, original or recreated, and to kind of end the story on people like Eve and what we know about subsequently what happened in their lives. I show you here this in the previous slide showed the cook room and this a kind of servants' hall, if you will, a kind of gathering room at the far end of the building. We use these spaces in a couple of ways. Again, as I said, primarily, certainly much of the time, the tour involves guests being taken through the house and the quarter, and the story being told in third person. There also is first-person interpretation that you catch a glimpse of here. And then I'm going to be very frank and say that I love what Christy's reference to kind of farm days at Tredegar. And so I think one challenge for museums is to stay on the story, to, as Christy said, kind of decide what story you're really trying to tell and how do we tell it, because on the one hand, the Peyton Randolph complex beautifully integrates the stories of the people who live there, but on the other hand, we have interpreters, more often than not, white interpreters now, cooking in the kitchen. And so the story, to my eye or ear, really trails away from our real intention in doing this, is just to focus on race relations, slavery, and the lives of people. So I guess I use this example intentionally to make the point that that mainstreaming has some shortcomings, and that in some ways, I have to say, that a site like the Quarter at Carter's Grove was so clearly focused by the nature of the place. There is a sort of clarity of story, clarity of presentation. There's no question at a site like that about what's being taught, that the visitors are meant to experience, to think about the lives of the people who live there and how they and we today are affected by perceptions, political constructs about race, and the story of forced labor, and the agency of people who worked within that system. Thank you.
Thanks, And now to Sarah.
Thanks. Are we still going to try to hit your questions?
Sorry?
Are we still going to try to hit your questions?
We are going to
Okay.
try. Yes,
Okay.
we have. I should mention, we have a set of, once they've talked about their case studies, I have a couple of questions I'm going to pose to them to sort of get this conversation going, although I may not need many. You know, we'll see. We'll
Okay.
see.
Museums, I think, essentially provide an opportunity for collective and public understanding of history. For us who provide that, for those who research and produce the information, for the public who visits. On the other hand, imagination is a lonely enterprise. The things we construct in our own heads largely remain within our own heads. And I think that museums possessing the opportunity for the collective have an obligation for it, have an obligation to use the research, to use the collective understanding, to bring in race relations, and to tell stories, to make the past real. In thinking about this, I thought that the transferal of a great book into a reasonable movie, for example, provides certain challenges in being as good as our imaginations. a great book can often make a reasonable movie. In the transferal of incomplete data sets into physical reconstructions, there are similar challenges. I think my point in this is that the stories that we tell, those narratives we construct, are the most important parts of the reconstructions. Do we have an obligation to attempt the reconstructions? I think so. Do we have an obligation to attempt the stories? Absolutely. I claim that because of this opportunity that museums provide, the process of reconstruction is worthwhile. The public and shared interpretation of history, and in this case, slavery, provides common elements that we can understand together, beyond the loneliness of our individual imaginations. Do we have an obligation to get it right? Yes, certainly. Do we sometimes get it almost right? Often. Do we sometimes get it wrong? Yeah, we do. So what do we do in that case? We keep working, either in the production of information that guides these reconstructions, the production of information that guides the storytelling, and we who are charged with transferring that into our shared understanding, we sometimes have to do it again. We have to keep working to get it right. I have just a couple pictures to show. This is a picture of the reconstructed slave quarter at Ashlon Highland. Highland was James Monroe's home, sitting behind me a couple miles around the ridge there. And these slave quarters were reconstructed in 1985 for the purpose of ameliorating the lack of African American interpretation on the site. It's an interesting case. It was reconstructed based on a 1908 photograph, based on some limited excavations there, and then not a lot beyond that. And it was done out of enthusiasm to put in African American interpretation. So the concerns here, this is not a typical slave structure of Monroe's lifetime. Okay, the architecture does not evoke what we understand of the building, that it was originally constructed in the 1790s. In 1818 was converted into quarters for guests, in Monroe's word. And then what was standing in 1908 became, again, this piece that remained as far back as we got. And so that, in fact, what was copied in the reconstruction. So it provides an African American presence. Can we examine the architecture to think more? Yeah. Can we perhaps do continued excavations to provide more information? I think so. And can we work on the story that we tell? Absolutely. And so I return to constructing the narratives that tell the story, constructing the narratives that reflect the lives that aren't recorded as much as others here, and put this forward as a case study of an early adopter reconstruction, one that's probably about to come around again to another generation to examine. And we, in our conversations ahead of time, have talked about the range of approaches to reconstruction. And this is the far end of one, of yes, let's build it. And, the details are very faithful to that 1908 photograph. Whether that 1908 photograph is essentially a Monroe period structure is another question. So that's one point I'd like to make. The other is just a mention of the more remote dwellings. We sometimes find ourselves focusing on the plantation core. It's often what remains as plantation properties are parceled off, and the little bit that remains around the main house stays with the house, whereas the more remote land now belongs to different properties. Our research at Monticello, under Fraser Nyman's direction, since the mid-90s has broadened our awareness of the Monticello plantation beyond the mountaintop, as we say, and the whole of the plantation property. So here we are with a look at Monticello, the mountaintop, with beautiful Mulberry Row and the gardens, but with the rest of the landscape stretching beyond to remind us that the core of the plantation here, as elsewhere, is not all that there was. Sometimes it's all that can be visited, and certainly we usually know a lot more about that core than we know about other parts. Here's a map of the Monticello Department of Archaeology survey on Monticello Mountain with the discovered archaeological sites. I think up to 40-some now, including those off the mountain. And about 2/3 of those are domestic sites of the Jefferson period. So if you look at the mountain top, do I have a pointer here? I cannot pierce Gary's eye with the laser. So the mountain top, and then the long stretch down to the Rivanna River, and the area where many other slave dwellings were located. So just a reminder that the mountaintop is not all there is. Okay, you can next slide me if you want. And this gives you an image of one of the slave dwellings that was discovered on Site 8, home to enslaved field hands there. Not much was left. This is not even destroyed to the ground, but below the ground with plowing, a common phenomenon, certainly in the Virginia Piedmont and beyond. So the research that it takes to discover, recover data, and interpret these is even greater than elsewhere. This one is about half a mile from the main house at Monticello. So that serves as a reminder that I think probably we'll address later in the questions, but that these remote quarters were home to enslaved people whose jobs were different from those who lived at plantation cores, different experiences, different roles. The houses themselves are very likely harder to interpret. They're harder to discover, and finally, they're harder for visitors to see. So just a reminder of an additional layer of complexity in what we're trying to do. Thanks.
Matt is going to share with us some of the examples, case studies at Montpelier.
Thank you, Gary. Good afternoon. At Montpelier, yeah, that's
Sorry, did I say at Montpelier? I did say at Montpelier.
I absorbed it. I didn't remember.
At Montpelier.
Very, very similar trajectories in our two properties, so it's some amazing parallels. No, what I wanted to present to you all today was a case study of how we've been trying to represent a set of homes at Montpelier. They're homes to enslaved domestics that we've known about for a little over 10 years. And present this case study in terms of the different ways we've tried to represent these homes to visitors. And I love what you mentioned, Sarah, in terms of the transfer of ideas into almost a movie or a way to help visitors imagine what was here, and how you can go from an empty tableau where these buildings are and you're trying to present it just sharing the ideas, to everything to completely reconstructing the buildings. So there's that thing there that people can actually ask questions about. And we've experienced this with the buildings in what we call the South Yard. As you all might know, we recently just finished a restoration of the mansion at Montpelier, and we've restored it back to the 1820s appearance. And what we've got at Montpelier is essentially a restored 1820s house set in an amalgamation of different forms of landscape. It's set in a 20th century landscape. Part of it is a restored front fence line along the front, but then other areas, when we finished in 2008, the main thing that was missing was all these sets of buildings that surrounded the house that were not only kitchens and smokehouses, but people's homes. And our first clues to these buildings being around the mansion came in around 2002. When we began the restoration, there was a few glimmers from the archaeology that had been done in the past of what buildings might be there. 2002, we began the restoration. The word started getting out there, and there was an organization, the Pennsylvania Historical Society, that contacted us and said, we heard about your restoration. It piqued our interest because, remember, there's a document in our archives that showed a map with the mansion and 7 outbuildings. Would you be interested in seeing it? And after we stopped hyperventilating, we were like, please, yes. So with the wonders of modern technology, they send a scanned image of this map. And what you can see with this is there's 7 buildings that are represented to the north of the mansion. There's the north of the mansion. There's the kitchen. Far to the south, there's a line heading to the stable. And then in between, but very near to the house, there are 3 buildings, 3 of which are represented on this map that was drawn in 1837 as, servants' houses, and then the 2 smokehouses. And when we matched up the archaeology that had been done in the 1990s with this map, we found that one of these structures, one of the homes for servants as listed on this map, matched up exactly with a central chimney that had been located. So we felt this map was pretty much right on, and it was a good representation of what we had. And so what we wanted to do, we're still doing archaeology around the house to mitigate what was going to be done, to make sure we weren't going to be disturbing deposits around the mansion with the changes that were happening with putting in the infrastructure for the restored mansion. But one of the early things that we did to represent the space out there is we tried to outline where these structures are out there. And I'm going to leave this. I'm not going to point out because this is something visitors were seeing. This is a shot that was taken in 2008, so this is a little bit later in the restoration process. But one of the first things we did was we ran out with our transit, put pin flags in where the buildings should be in the corners. We outlined it with flagging tape, and that lasted about 2 days because every night the deer would run through and there'd be streams of flagging tape all across the yard. And so with my limited knowledge of vegetation, I said, well, why don't we spray Roundup in the area where the grass is, and we'll create these dead patches. And that we did it once, and I became very frightened about the soil chemistry and what that was going to be doing to our soil chemistry signature. So we stopped that. The next thing we did, and this is this continued evolution, is we did a timber base outline of the structure, and you can see this around the walnut tree that's right there, and that's based on where the insurance map showed the structure to be. And when we did this, we were excavating behind the 2 fir trees that are there. We were trying to locate the other structures to make sure there was confirmation this map was actually real. It was based on something. And when we were out there at the archaeology site, we were constantly talking to visitors, and we tried to explain to visitors that there were the buildings that were out there, and we'd point to the timbers that were on the ground. And people, sometimes they would get it, but most of the time they wouldn't. They'd ask, okay, are these timbers to protect the trees? Or there's a bench to sit on? And it was, visitors kind of got the idea that there were buildings out there, but it was hard to get beyond that. And this is more just, because people are there for about 10 minutes and then they're moving on. They're thinking about going back to their cars and where they're going to use the bathroom and where they're heading next. So it's a number of different narratives that are going on with visitors. And all this really came to a head in 2007. We've had two slave descendant gatherings at Montpelier. And in 2007, we had our second gathering. And the first gathering happened in 2001. There was no restoration work had even begun or has even begun to be conceptualized for the Montpelier Mansion. When folks came back in 2007, they were they were in awe with the restored mansion. I mean, at that time, the outside envelope, the exterior had been restored. And after, about a day into the event, there were a number of individuals that came up to me separately and said, this is, what you've done we all have done with the restoration is absolutely amazing. But what you've got in the South Yard at our ancestors' homes is appalling. And they said, you've represented our homes with what looks to be railroad ties and dead grass. And what's up with that? I mean, you've gone through this $24 million restoration. Isn't there some change left that you could better represent these buildings? So mea culpa, we're listening. Please write letters to the directors and the board. We'll change on this. And so what we started to think about in 2008 was ways to better develop this story. And one of the things we did, we had an incredible team of restoration architects that were working at Montpelier at the time. Everything from Ed to Willie Graham to Mark Winger to Gardner Halleck, who's here at Monticello now, and also Chad Keller. And what Chad and Gardner came up with was a three-dimensional reconstruction or computerized visualization about what these structures looked like. And again, this is based on the insurance map. And even with that, what we quickly realized that having visitors transpose this image onto the landscape was still quite difficult. And we assembled a steering, just a think tank to start to think about the landscape. And what came out of this was there needed to be better ways to represent the landscape. And one of the ways, especially in the South Yard, where the homes for enslaved domestics were. And one of the things that quickly came about was, the idea of doing ghosted structures. I think maybe a lot of you all have seen these at St. Mary's City, also at Poplar Forest. They've done a great job representing these. But the challenge with what we had at Montpelier is these ghosted structures would be right beside a restored mansion where we strove for authenticity in restoring the building. And what we wanted to do was to make sure, one, that what we were going to be ghosting would be correct, and then also do it in a way that was had that same feeling of authenticity, not restoration, but authenticity as the restored mansion. So meanwhile, all this thought process was going on, in 2009, we applied to NEH for a collaborative research grant to do a broader archaeological study of the enslaved community at Montpelier. And part of this grant was to excavate the South Yard to see what evidence there was there to get this right. Another structure that we excavated that we had plans to excavate, and we did excavate in 2010, is just beyond the fir trees right here. And that was turned out to be a log structure that was the home of an enslaved artisan. And then last year and this year, we're excavating a set of enslaved field quarters that are beyond the visitor center. And what's great about all these sites we found is they're within the visitor core. So actually when people park their car, they're closer to the quarters for enslaved field hands than they are to the mansion. But getting back to the South story, South Yard story. When we did the excavations in 2011, what we found in the South Yard was really compelling evidence for these structures. If you notice on the slide, what we've got is we found the corners of both buildings, and they turned out to not be 20 by 32 as the insurance map depicted, but 16 by 32, so two 16 by 16 pins put together around this central chimney. And we worked with Willie Graham to develop a set of plans for these buildings to do the ghosting, not in standard ghosting fashion, but actually to reconstruct the timber frameworks of these buildings to represent the size and mass on the landscape. So what we had Willie draw up is a set of, as authentic as possible timber frame plans. And what we've done is we've built these on the landscape as timber frame ghosted structures. And one aspect about this this restored space is, well, actually not that it's a restored space, that's the exact point, is this is not a restored space, but this is an interpretive space. So this is not doing a reconstruction, these timber frames are interpretive tools to help the guides, help visitors imagine the size and massing of these structures. So then what we can do is go to the next stage with the visitors to talk about what these buildings are. And we get great reactions from visitors. Visitors will come and see these and say, what are those half-finished buildings on the landscape? And that's exactly what we want, is them to say that, because first they recognize there are buildings on the landscape, and we can go to the next set of questions, which these buildings were homes for enslaved domestics, some were smokehouses. But the other aspect about half-finished is it really gets into who we are as an institution. We're in the middle of understanding and doing the research on this plantation, and we don't have the answers yet. The nature of these structures being framed with no clapboard or shingles on the roof is really, it gets down to, if we could easily and pretty cheaply put on the siding and the roof, but then you'd have a wind load. Once you have a wind load, you've got to tie the buildings down to the ground. Tying the buildings to the ground, you've got to have foundations, and you're impacting the archaeology. So in true PETA fashion, we want to say no archaeology sites are disturbed by the construction of these timber frames. It's all light on the landscape, and really, it's light on the cultural landscape. For another reason, is because we still don't have the information to do a full restoration. I mean, technically, the buildings that are further away from the mansion, the two duplexes where we did complete archaeology, I mean, we could restore those today. But the problem is that we haven't excavated the entirety of this complex. And you can't just simply pick out one building and restore it. It's part of this organic whole, this yardscape. And when we do the restoration, what we want to do is restore not only the buildings, but the yards, and have a better understanding of how these homes intersected with the inhabitants' living and work lives. And so what we're left with what we've done with the South Yard is a pretty much a continuum of methods of trying to represent these on the landscape. And what we're left at now is what we have in terms of the South Yard is we have a path that leads through the South Yard with interpretive signs that talk about the space, what it represents, and this path is in essence a shortcut back to the visitor center, where we get a lot of folks going through this area. But we're very anxious to hear about some of your thoughts and questions about this as we move forward with this discussion. And one thing I just want to say as a quick little advertisement: if any of you all are around Montpelier, please come visit. The landscape is out there for lots of walks to see, and it's not too far from here. So go to Gary and Frank. Thanks.
So in addition to some case studies, we'll hear a little bit of a broader perspective about similar kinds of endeavors and principles to guide from Frank.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. In my view, historic sites are enormously powerful things. Their power deriving from their authentic nature. A state of antiquity, no matter how altered, speaks volumes more than a reconstruction, no matter how perfect or accurate. I have no patience with reconstructions of whole cloth, and I can scarcely force myself to pay attention when they are presented to me. During my tenure as Vice President of Historic Sites at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where I served for about 13 years, overseeing their 20 historic sites around the nation, including Montpelier, when it first came to the Trust in 1985. I had the opportunity to visit Anton Chekhov's house, a dacha outside of Moscow. I was really impressed with it. It was a mid-19th century house. It was sagging there, overlooking his cherry orchard. It was beautifully furnished. The man had just left. I was so impressed with the way that it had been preserved, not restored, not anything, just preserved. It just spoke to me. So at the end of the tour, I said to the guide, I'm really impressed with what you've done here. Your preservation efforts have just been remarkable. And he said to me, this is a reconstruction. The house burned down 10 years ago. To the ground. And we reconstructed it. And I felt so cheated. I felt as if I had been used. Jim Fitch, Professor James Marston Fitch, who was my teacher at Columbia University in the historic preservation program there, would have defended that reconstruction, although he was vehemently opposed to them, on the premise that it was a reconstruction that was based in memory, recent memory, and that house meant so much to the Russian people that its absence was killing them. And they had to have it back. And they had complete documentation of what it looked like. And so they reconstructed it. And on that ground, and only that ground of recent memory, would he have supported the concept of bringing that house back? I think that those of us who work with historic sites have a moral responsibility to the public to be true and not to deceive or misinform our visitors. The public that visits historic sites is often uninformed, and they are vulnerable to what we tell them. They're ready to accept what they hear and what they're told. Typically, a historic house tour is a passive form of education and is presented to people who are engaged in a recreational activity. I think it's impossible in that situation to separate reconstruction from interpretation. They're both tightly, they're right together. Ruth Abram, who was the founder of the Tenement Museum in New York City, created that place to explain the experience of European immigrants coming to New York City from the late 19th century through the early 20th century. And the way that New Yorkers treated them, and they were accepted or not accepted into the New York community. It was basically about the issue of tolerance of one group toward another group. She went on, after she created this really remarkable place, to create a broader network of places that she called museums of conscience. These were places around the world that dealt with the subject of tolerance in some way or other, and they included such things as a a Russian gulag camp, a Nazi concentration camp, and a slave house on Gorée Island in Senegal. I visited that slave house, and I stood there in an opening looking out toward the ocean where slaves had been taken to boats. And I was standing there, and it took my breath away. My knees were shaking. It was such an experience. Now, I don't know, I know that slave house was the real place. I doubt that it looked like it did when the slaves were there, because it was a cleaned up place and it couldn't have been that way. But the ocean was there. I knew I was in that building, and it had a tremendous power over me. Our plantations in America are the places where slavery happened. They are the real places where people were enslaved. It is so important and so incumbent upon us as the stewards of those sites not to mislead people about what they really looked like. And they don't look the way that they looked. And that's just a given. Old buildings change. I used to have hair. But I'm me, and those buildings are themselves. They just don't look the same. I believe that imagination is a tremendously powerful thing. And I believe that words and stories and oral traditions can evoke personal images that don't deceive. I think that, as we've heard, and this has been a really enlightening conference for me, slavery is not my subject, old buildings are my subject. So I have learned a tremendous amount here, and I know now that there are descriptions of relationships between the enslaved and the people who enslave them. And I know that the field is changing now, and it's changing rapidly, and it's going to change even more because of virtual comparative analysis, as we heard about, genetics, new research, who knows what. There's so much information coming down the pike that it's going to change, and our story is going to get more and more and more accurate. And that's a great thing, because we can tell that more accurate story at historic sites. We have, at these places, the ground. We have artifacts in many cases. We have partial structural remains, as we just heard. And occasionally, we have real buildings that related to slavery. At Hampton Plantation, we saw original buildings. Just the other day, I saw original slave houses at Arlington House in Virginia. They are here. I've seen them around. We should use those. Historic houses, I don't think, can provide everything. They are what they are. I think we need to use what we've got, but not manufacture what we don't. Where buildings have vanished, and slave dwellings were also often built of ephemeral things. They just don't last. They weren't maintained. Huge houses fall apart over the years, never mind small cabins, which just disappear back into the earth. Where they have gone away, I think that Reconstruction can offer a very, very limited opportunity. With the exception of living history, perhaps we can't evoke the truth. We can't reconstruct dirt, noise, smells. It's just not there. You can't bring that back. I wonder, and I asked the question at lunch of one of our speakers, what could be gained, or is there something to be gained by having a living history reconstruction of a slave community at a place? I can't imagine what that would really look like. I can't divide the theater that is involved in that from what really might have happened. I don't understand how the reality of something like that could be gotten across. We are, in my opinion, when it comes to Reconstruction, reduced to a consideration, only, I think, a consideration of physical shape, space, and enclosure. I think it's been referred to maybe as the physical landscape of slavery. And I guess we can do that. I mean, here at Montpelier, you're looking at that image of Mulberry Row where there used to be buildings and there aren't. There are foundations there now. If you look at the image pretty closely, there's some trees that are growing right on top of where a foundation would be, so they couldn't have been there. I think you could put up something there on Mulberry Row if public pressure was just too great and something had to go back in there. You could put up something there, maybe what Matt did at Montpelier, that would evoke a sense of enclosure, show you more clearly than a foundation does the proximity of buildings to the main house. But it sort of goes back to the thing that was being discussed before about strategic plan. Is that really the strategic plan for this property? I think that the more real these reconstructions become, and the further from artifice that the object that you build is, the more danger there is for people to misinterpret it. Because I think that no matter what you tell crowds of visitors, they don't listen, and they will believe what they see. And even if you tell them it's not a real building, they'll come away thinking it was a real building. It's just, I've seen it happen time after time. It's nothing that you can control. So the danger of deception grows with the degree of accuracy of the perceived reconstruction. And I think that that is really a no-win situation. I think that it's treacherous ground to venture on. I think that, and I hope we have questions about this so that we can explore this issue a little bit, but I believe that...
I think we will.
But I believe that with historic sites, I think that treating them for what they are and dealing with them for what they have, understanding that every historic site cannot do everything, and that goes to interpreting slavery, I think. We should take advantage of the ones where you can do it the best. Somehow those should collaborate with the ones that can't do it as well to provide something. I think there's way too little interaction between historic sites and collaboration between them. And that, I think, in slavery could provide, in the interpretation of slavery, could provide a real solution that would help us. But for the sites as they are, I think they speak best with their own physical parts, whatever is there. And with that, they can speak the truth with eloquence. Thank you.
So I'm going to invoke the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. So, Ed, is it a big deception to, what Frank suggested is if you go to this process of even the most elaborate, if I heard correctly, the most elaborate and most careful kinds of reconstructions pose the greatest hazard for what they will communicate that wasn't there, that wasn't true. So thinking about either of the examples you gave of the Carter's Grove, the slave quarters on the home farm at Carter's Grove, or at the Randolph Urban Plantation. I mean, what's your thought about that?
Well, I really respect what Frank is saying, and I too, I wasn't lucky enough to go to Columbia and have Fitch teach me, but I knew Fitch, and I knew you had to be pretty smart if you're going to disagree with him. And Jim Fitch was a wonderful guy, and so I think frankly, I think he's a very articulate spokesman on a topic that Ada Louise Huxtable, I'll go ahead and say something really dangerous, I think, was kind of a blabbermouth about, that there's this there is this perspective that we grew up in as preservationists, in the 1970s or whatever, of respecting the original and being anti-scrape and believing that you shouldn't restore or reconstruct. And I mean, I know that I'm on John Ruskin's side and William Morris's side on the buildings they talked about. Ruskin first articulated it, and then William Morris, put it into police action, that the sort of prevention of the wholesale, really kind of destruction of historic monuments in Europe by the sort of foolish restoration back to a perceived greater moment of glory. There's this great story, it's probably apocryphal, that William Morris heard that there was a restoration going on some lovely little parish church, and he arrived and found that they'd ripped off the, Romanesque facade, putting on a, high Gothic facade, and he apparently kind of pulled the minister out of the pulpit, almost, and vocally, if not physically, and attacked him for the destruction of what he'd been responsible for. So I really embrace this idea of anti-scrape and not senselessly restoring or reconstructing things. But I guess I think that one can draw a distinction. Maybe it's a false one, but I see it as a kind of distinction between what you do for public history and what you do to save a great monument and protect a great monument. And I think it is naive in a way to say that you're not going to restore further a site that's seen so much restoration. And so, if you take the example of, I think it's great that Monticello is doing the symposium. I think it's the classic, wonderful, perfect thing for Monticello to do. But I think the path is pretty clear on Mulberry Road, really, in that, that decision was made years ago, I think, when the when the Garden House was rebuilt and when the Oculus was put in the Dome Room, even though it might not ever really even been there. When the green paint was put to the floors of the entrance hall, when the Native American drawings and weavings were hung in the front hall, that the reality of many historic sites, including this one, is that there is a back and forth. There is the true cross, those bits that survive, but there are many other parts that get replaced every year, frankly, because of maintenance, well considered or otherwise. And so monuments are, there are a few monuments, lonely columns in the temple, temple columns in the Forum at Rome that should remain unsullied by restoration. But I think particularly in this region where restoration and reconstruction is a principal part of the discourse, the sort of exploration of the lives of different kinds of people in the pre-industrial Chesapeake and how race relations and slavery are a part of that. It seems to me that archaeology, documentary history, physical exploration of buildings, and then the expression of those findings in 3 dimension is a viable and kind of important point. So this is a very long-winded. I won't answer any more questions.
All right. Well, let's.
So my point is that I completely embrace and support what Frank says about monuments, but I also
Doesn't sound it.
Let's open the floor up to questions and comments. So in the center there, Lenny Sorensen, who's with the eyeglasses, hands raised in the back there. We'll start with Lenny.
Frank, you spoke, I think, movingly on what you perceived as the need of the Russian people to have this particular site. And I would argue that we might look at the ways in which the contemporary public has a need on level for some of these sites. And I cited the fact that we're not that far removed from slavery. I was born in 1942. My grandmother was born in 1889. Her father was born in 1861. So there are people my age, older, who, when they reach back literally one generation, sat on the laps of and held the hands of people who were raised by enslaved people. So it's really, really personal. And so having these buildings, and I've talked to enough people in Mulberry Row and around, that vital sense of wanting to feel a building, a place, the material culture, to have it. If you have the house of the master, then we want to have the house of the person that made the master's life possible. So those, I think it's very immediate. It's still very fresh. It isn't just some deeply distant thing, early 18th century. It's very, very close to many of us.
I have questions.
Very good. And then we'll come over here.
In sessions 2, 3, and 4, I've heard the passion and the commitment to authenticity. But what I'm also hearing is that a lot of the programming is done in response to protest or complaint. And with the exception of the Get Word project, there doesn't seem to be, or I've not heard, of any ongoing dialogue with the communities you claim you're trying to represent. And I find that disturbing. So I would like to hear from any of the panelists about what your sites have engaged in terms of involving these communities. Or are you deciding what people need to know?
Yeah, we at Montpelier we've built a community of descendants of Montpelier slaves that we're engaging not only through gatherings but also this summer we're planning an event where really what we've done so far with the enslaved landscape with the timber frame buildings, if there was a reason, a need to bring those timber frames down and do something else, it would be an investment of about $50,000 that we put into those, and we could do it. We could make the change. Moving forward onto more permanent ways of interpreting the enslaved community at Montpelier, what we want to do, like this July, we're going to have an open house to invite both not only the Madison slave descendants who have taken part in these events in the past, but in 2007 we invited the local Orange community, anyone that was descended from families in Orange, to take part in this. Because really with Montpelier, we don't have a sense of the entire community just with the families that know they're descended from Montpelier. There are numerous families out there in Orange who can't trace their descent through oral history or the written record, but just being in that area, there are connections there, and we're trying to build that consensus, that sort of I don't want to call it outreach because that sounds like charity, but this community to respond to those questions. I mean, we restored a Freedman's farm, the Gilmore farm, back in 2005, and a critical part of restoring that. This is a post-emancipation structure. It was built by a former slave of James Madison. And part of the questions that were involved in restoring that building was to restore it back to 1910, where the structure was at that point, or bring it back to 1880. And what the general consensus was within the African American community of scholars and the descendant community and the physical evidence of the house was to bring it back to 1880. So I don't know if that's answering the question, but we're making attempts to bring this larger consensus together and try to hear, see what the response is. But I think what's happened at Monticello with the Getting Word is it's something that's inspired us all, and hopefully, if there are other models for this, we would love to hear it. I mean, this is the great thing about having this kind of gathering. There's so much passion and commitment in this room, and everybody has examples that it's great to learn from.
Any other panelists want to comment to the question? I certainly will elaborate a little more in terms of Monticello as well. Twice in 2011, we held 2 community forums where we discussed both our intentions and ideas for the interpretation of Mulberry Row. The first one of those, which I wasn't at, but I will paraphrase my colleague Susan's, her characterization of the reaction when we were sharing there are all these possibilities, and you could ghost the structure, you could virtually recreate, you could rebuild from the ground up, and the answer was, we don't care about all that, put it back. Right? That was the bottom line answer was, why haven't you done this yet? So, we heard that feedback loud and clear. We also know that we want to make sure if we make that decision about how to put something tangible above ground, that we know enough to do that with confidence, and to do, because of the pitfalls that Frank and others have described. So yes, we have sought some direction. We haven't sought it every step of the way. We have sought the direction of advisory boards as well, of scholars, archaeologists, historians, African American historians of African American history as well in those endeavors. So there's been some degree of engagement on that front. Yeah, Lenny, did you?
I was going to say, in the 2 meetings that we held here, one here had 60 participants, of whom 40 were various members of the Charlottesville larger community who were contacted and came, and then we had 120 people at the downtown center.
Yep.
Meeting again on a broadcast array of invitations, and we had a very good response. So I think there are probably many outreach programs that wasn't the topic here, and perhaps that's something that we just didn't end up having.
Right. Let's come. I believe someone over here. Yes, lady just here in the second row had a question, comment.
I feel called to say something a little outrageous, and that is the sense of elitism. We've had a lot of natural disasters happen in this area recently, earthquakes that we didn't expect, major storms. And if one of those took down the Washington Monument or Monticello, wouldn't you want to build it back up? So why not build up these slave quarters? What makes that part of history so much lesser that you're saying, we're not going to put that back up? But I would venture to say that if something disastrous happened to one of our major monuments, that you'd want to put that up. But I do feel slavery is part of our history, and it involved oppression, and why would we not want to bring that to light and honor that in the same way?
I'll take a shot at that. I don't think there's anybody up here that doesn't believe that in the case of the destruction of an original slave dwelling that might remain, that it would not be the most worthwhile and important thing to reconstruct. What we're talking about here is constructing buildings that have disappeared, that don't exist, where for the best available scholarship, you have to make choices about what they might have looked like, which people are then going to see, and which your perhaps inaccurate choices will become truth in their minds. And I mean, what do you think about that?
I'll just say what I think, and then I'd love to hear what you have to say. Because slaves did not have access to resources, their buildings were necessarily given short shrift. So they're more likely to be the ones that fall down and are not replaced, whereas the wealthy folks have the means to fix up something if it was destroyed. So in essence, that's a long-term discriminatory practice, that the poorer folks in the community do not get the same respect as the more wealthy.
One comment just to make is, hopefully what we try to communicate is we're trying to show you a range of possibilities, right? Not everyone here is saying don't do it, right? Okay, just want to make sure. Diane, let's go to Diane, and then we'll get over here.
And Frank, this is a question for you. You don't have a problem interpreting the dependencies where African Americans lived in the Weaver's Cottage, and it's only the buildings that no longer exist that we can see. The whole building. So you wouldn't have a problem with the joinery, for example, because the chimney is there.
No. The only thing I'm saying, how am I not saying this clearly enough? that there is confusion here. Mm-hmm. I'm saying when it's completely gone, when there is nothing there, and you recreate something out of completely new material, how can you know that that's what it looked like? I'll give you here's one thing that I have observed. Reconstructions, when I have seen them, generally do not attempt, and this is, I think, a good thing, to look old. Chekhov's house accepted. They generally look new. Okay, so they're rebuilt as carefully as anybody can think to reconstruct them in the method that, as far as we know, they would have been constructed in. And so they are constructed of new material, made the same way as they used to be, but it's new, and they look brand new. And then they'll furnish them. I've seen them furnished with what must be researched and appropriate furnishings, which I'm never positive about. But when you look at it, it's brand new. So it probably existed that way in history for a week, at which point it was used and, given the abilities to maintain, probably began to change very quickly. What it looked like when people had been living in it for 10 or 15 years under the conditions that the enslaved had to live in, do we know that? And so when you see it, which I think is probably the best way we can present it as brand new, what does that mean? What impression are you taking away?
I guess I'm just thinking about Carter's Grove and about how it never looked new to me. It always looked as if it had been there in the landscape and had really adhered to the landscape and to the people who live there. And so I would just use, that example.
Outside or inside?
Both. And I'm sure you were there before it was there. But when I came, and maybe I was there a year after it had been in place or whatever, but I just didn't give the impression that this was something that was built just for this occasion for people to see.
Do you think the people thought it was real?
Oh, I think they definitely did. Definitely.
I know I forget why. Oh, so yes, back in the second to last row back there.
Yes, I'm Wyoni Edwards Ingram from Colonial Williamsburg. I want to go back to a question that was asked earlier about the community involvement, the African American community. At times we do overlook that some of the communities already within the museums. For example, at Colonial Williamsburg, and this is from the very start, the African American community was very much a part of the museum. In fact, it literally, physically built that museum. And they were there, members of the community was there representing their history from the very start. And today we do have communication and contact with different members of the community. For example, we have an African American Baptist church where we do have association with, and we have an exhibition which we do in two places. If we have one of the church, which is the current congregation, is outside of the historic area, but we do have the site, and pretty close to the site of the earlier church, we have an exhibition in a carriage house representing the early church and also the later community. And I also want to talk quickly about another incident that we try to keep in touch with the community, although I'm sure we can do a lot better. We can do a lot better in trying to reach out to the African American community on what we're doing. But recently we found a burial and we had to rebury or ask permission from the African American community for permission to do scientific study on the remains. And we were able to contact a member of the museum very quickly. And he was able to get to others in the community to show us what is the African American reaction, what is their idea or understanding of the problem. And so there's always that outreach. So what I'm trying to say is that we should not overlook the staff within our various organizations. There are quick contact and outreach to get to that feeling or to get to that association with a wider African American community.
Thank you, Wyoni. All right. Sorry, we'll come back across this way.
On the preservation question, Frank, we talked about this last night, and I'm really ambivalent about it because on one hand, I want to see something, but on the other hand, I've been places and the houses, the reconstructions, sometimes, I mean, you could say they look like little Nantucket bungalows, and you can hear almost the relief. I was at Ashlon yesterday when people walked in to that place, and they said, these are the slave quarters, and it's like, the next sentence would be, this wasn't so bad.
That's right. Yep.
I mean, I've lived in worse places than this. I mean, it's to talk about this without talking about the sort of political climate in which this very, very volatile, subject is discussed is, it's very tough because what will people make of it? So I don't have an answer. I'm torn. I'd like to see something, but on the other hand, I know this is a contentious question about how bad was it, and depending upon what it looks like, I mean, the question will be answered very differently.
Yes.
You want me to-
Yeah, go.
It seems to me that one point that is sort of being made that I might try to articulate a little better is that certain kinds of buildings survive and others don't. The British call it the vernacular threshold. What they mean is, beginning in the 15th, 16th century, is the first era in which in the southeast of England you've got non-gentry houses that built to a level of substance that they can survive. So I have some of the same ambivalence, and I really am an anti-scrape guy, even though it seems like I'm not because of what the jobs I've had. But I do think there's a distinction between that visiting buildings in a landscape, a place like Monticello, is such a potent medium. I mean, where could you go in the world and have a stronger sense of what one's perception of Jefferson is than to go into that house? And I think to say that you have to deny that experience to all the subjects who occupied primarily houses that didn't make it over the vernacular threshold, that they lived in houses that, usually for particular reasons, didn't survive. I mean, most of the 18th century freestanding separate quarters for enslaved people, they weren't like the ones being built in the 1840s and 50s. They weren't really built to survive. And so I think, we want to be cautious in what we do to old buildings, particularly ones that have many layers, and it's our responsibility to protect those layers, I think. But I think you also, I'll just finish this one sentence, which I know is a run-on, and that is that.
As long as you take a breath, you're good.
Yeah. That if you deny that potent vehicle for comprehending the lives of people by being a purist and saying, no, it's gone, so you can never have that experience, it's kind of unfair. It's not, it's not what we should do.
So, but I think you can do it. You just have to do it in a way that does not suggest that it is real.
Right.
It has value, obviously, as an interpretive tool, but my big question is, how do you remain honest to what I thought was so significant about historic sites, is their authenticity, and make sure that nobody comes away with the idea that what they saw was the real thing. They can learn a ton from it. They can learn how it was constructed. They can learn what was in it. They can learn about the people that were there. But not to have that sense that they actually saw the real thing. So it might be that the solution for Monticello, if it feels it has to have an example of what a freestanding dwelling was like, and that is not going to be satisfied by restoring any of the ones that still remain, because I've got it right, there's still 2. So if you were to construct one, then construct it in such a way that it is obviously not real.
Did you have a comment, Sarah?
Yes, I guess I wanted to just push that a little further because, in part we're here to help Monticello think about this question, but I'll be very self-serving and say that as a brand new site director with a reconstruction that, as Annette points out, is, portrays a falsely positive, perhaps by just being anachronistic, perhaps for deeper material reasons, it portrays a falsely positive view of the conditions of slavery. So, I have many questions to ask on, where do we go from here? And so I would just push further and really say, what would that be like? What would it be like to have a building that was built so as to be obviously not original, to not trick the visitor into a false understanding? What do you recommend? Can you give us examples of things you've seen?
No.
Okay. But before we leave that thought, is there anyone in attendance who has some? I can give you a very good example. Hold on, wait. Back. We'll come to John. We'll come to you too, John.
Why don't you just give it a warning label?
That would be visual. That would be visual. So
it's not a bad idea. Let's give this idea some thought.
Hi, I feel like I'm on Phil Donahue. My name's Sarah Pope. I'm the director of Historic Menoken. We're in the Northern Neck, a site Ed Chappell knows very well, a site Frank will be visiting tomorrow. We are in the crosshairs of this conversation, if you don't know Menoken. It is a 18th century plantation site. The big house is partially collapsed. It's in ruin. Everything else is an archaeological feature. And we're grappling with what to do with this. And I want to let you know that there is, in the academic field of architecture, a renewed interest in this discussion. The Harvard Graduate School of Design is focusing a spring semester studio on Menoken and the issues that we're facing, reconstruction versus a modern expression of recognizing the varied histories at Menoken. And these 12 students, they're architecture students and landscape architecture students, will be presenting their ideas in front of a juried panel in May. And we're going to share that with the public. But I encourage you to come to Menoken and look on our website, menoken.org, to see how we're presenting this process to the public and engaging them. Just a little plug. So.
Okay. Now I'm going to force you to come all the way back over here. Professor Miller and Professor Kuhn. And then Harold, I'm working my way back down.
Yes, I think I have an example of that, and millions of people saw it in 2007, and that's historic Jamestown. But you have the fort. The reconstructed fort is located in one place. There is no illusion that that is the real thing, and then the archaeological remains are located on the island. So you have that kind of visceral experience of what seeing and touching and what life was like in the early settlement, but then you have a very different perspective when you go to the island and you visit the Archivarium. And I couldn't help thinking this when Ed was talking about the debate over where to reconstruct Carter's Grove, and you ultimately made the decision to put it on top of the actual remains. And that had a powerful emotional impact, but in ways that were also somewhat misleading. And that if you create a reconstruction that's trying to provide people with that visual experience, locating it someplace completely removed, and that highlights its artificiality. At the same time, it's trying, it's complex, but capturing that emotional connection with the materiality of the past. I think this is a possibility that wasn't considered on the panel. So.
Professor Miller has 2 Jamestowns.
To make a kind of process comment about the discussion that's going on, because I think it's an extremely urgent one. The professionals at the table are talking about accuracy and honesty in what you're actually presenting and so on. But I think we need to contextualize why this is such an intense issue. And the reason, as I'm realizing, listening to all of you, is that the reason we have a historic site is about honor. It's about respect. And when you have a site that includes something like Mr. Jefferson's house there, and people are there because of the importance of all of the people who were there to who we have become today. So it's a matter of honor and respect. And then you walk down Mulberry Row. And so the question of accuracy and the strategic issue of what it is we should try and represent, then in a way, Frank has a point where what do you respect more? What's actually managed to survive through the trials of time and the social circumstances that we're talking about, or our modern, fabricated, honest best effort as professionals to make a show? And I think there is a kind of honesty and respect that underlies Frank's position, and that if we're making these other strategic decisions as professionals, you need to take this matter of respect and integrity into account along with all the skills that you bring to this task.
Can I say one thing really quickly? Sure. This is the last thing I'll say. Is that I certainly agree that we need to be honest, and certainly we never said to anyone at Carter's Grove that these were original buildings. And so I think pretty much everybody went. I mean, they weren't listening very well if they didn't know that these were reconstructions. And so I think we got to be very honest, but we also have to be realistic. I mean, why are people so caught up on how original houses RS and T are when I haven't heard a single one of you complain about the very nice news from Susan that they're going to recreate the Kitchen Road. You know, why can that be easily put back where it was in Jefferson's era, but RS and T can't? I mean, why has no one questioned the Garden House? I mean, where's our brochure, our package that we...
Can I borrow the pointer? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
the
package we were all given when we arrived yesterday has a picture of Thomas Jefferson, somebody who looks like Thomas Jefferson, standing in the setting sun, shining through the Garden House. Why does that not bother anyone? Every time I've gone to Monticello, nobody said, "Oh yeah, warning label that Garden House." We know more, I would argue, about RS&T than we do about the Garden House, and we know RS&T existed. This is my last thing I'm going to say, but
it's 10 till, so yeah.
Right. And I tossed off this other example earlier, but the glass Oculus in the dome room, we don't know it was ever there, and yet it's there. It's put back 10 years ago. Nobody complains about that. Why? Pardon me?
Anybody fuss over the coffee house?
Not to me.
Ricky's mentioning a
Coffee
reconstructed
stand, right.
site at Colonial Williamsburg, the most recent, the coffee house.
I have to say something about original buildings again. On Wednesday, I guess, I visited Arlington House. Behind Arlington House are 2 original slave dwellings. Now, based on this conversation about what's authentic, what isn't authentic, reconstructing something that isn't there, I think anyone here would agree with me that a surviving slave dwelling is an amazingly important thing to have. But I don't want to pick on the Park Service. You had a fabulous presentation from someone from the Park Service just before. But when you walk into those slave dwellings at Arlington House, you have no sense of antiquity. It's gone. They are completely restored. You have no sense of somebody having lived in them over a period of time because they look brand new. And there's so much stuff inserted inside them for the visitor experience, as in signage and railings and stuff like that, even in a place that's completely reconstructed where it wouldn't matter if you scribbled all over the walls because the next day they could just make it new again. There is not that presence of age, which is the inherent thing that makes old buildings so wonderful, and it's stripped out. And I think that those places like that should be, and like the slave dwellings at Hampton, those need to be really carefully stewarded. And I think it's the responsibility of everybody in this room, since you are also invested in this issue, to force those places to really examine them carefully and decide at the highest level how to interpret those things, because they are not well interpreted now, and they are the real thing.
Down in the question, comment from the front row there.
I think the first thing I'll say is out of sight, out of mind. You don't see it, you don't think about it. What I'm about to say goes beyond academics. It's about the spiritual connection. The house might not be there, but the spirits of those people are still there. You know that the facade is not real, but you touch it and you still feel them, because their presence is still in the land. So when, you know, on the ground, in the area, the very essence of them. So the facade, it's not that, I mean, most people really don't, people know that it's not exact representation, it's the idea. It's imagining, using the imagination. So it doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but just the fact that it's there and you can see it and you can touch it and it's tangible, then you get the idea and then you connect. Even though you know that the facade is relatively new, when you touch it, you get that connection. So it goes beyond academics. It goes beyond connecting to those people that were there, those ancestors, and feeling it. So it goes beyond getting academic.
One of those things that people visit sites, historic sites, for is a sense of the numinous. It's kind of the fancy term for it, which we've all experienced. It's the I'm in the place where. You know, I'm in the spot where. It's a powerful emotional consideration. And I think that sense is something we have to consider at Monticello in thinking about how to approach recreation, reconstruction, understanding Mulberry Row as we have the main house, considering a lot of it has been reconstructed. So I'm sorry, I'll step back into the moderator role and shut up. Right here, Aurelia.
Thank you. From the point of view of a visitor, they want to see something. They want to see something. And as an interpreter at Monticello, I know the foundation wants to honor the slave families. They're trying to figure out how do you do that, because you already have a problem of having an iconic house. That's the thing. Then what do you put beside it to honor the people that worked in and around the house and give it as much authenticity as possible? Do you build a lot of buildings, or do you just use one as an example? So I know the struggle that they've had over the years. What do we do? Now, two good things. We have much of what Jefferson has in his mind. We have the drawings of what he wanted, so they can get as close to what he had in his plans as possible. They just have to choose what period. Okay? But here's the addition. You have live interpretation. So it's not a building or buildings standing alone. You have people that are walking through, we're going through there every hour, talking about the people who lived in the homes. So this will add to the structure when you have live interpretation going on, with people going on, and we're talking about the people that we think live there. And we can kind of narrow it down to some of the families we think would have been living on Mulberry Row. So, I don't know. The iconic house really is the problem, because then what do you do with Mulberry Row to honor the slaves that lived and worked there?
Sarah, did you have a comment?
Yeah, if I can just briefly. Thanks, Aurelia. And that brings me to something I've been thinking about for a long time, and something that we talked about briefly before the panel. And what we talked about briefly was the creation of narratives, where with or without reconstruction, creating that narrative to interpret the lives of enslaved people is crucial, right? Making sure that story gets out. And the thing that I've wrestled with for a long time is that distinction between commemoration and interpretation, right? And I see us tiptoeing around that and coming over it a few times, because all the things that we've said here, the institution of slavery was an institution that ended at a certain point, but we have those human connections that go back, that are not so far away. We want to commemorate. We also need to interpret. We need to teach. We need to explain. In some cases, we need to do that by grabbing people's imagination. So how do we do all of these things? When you talk about Monticello wanting to do the right thing, I know Monticello wants to do the right thing. I've been a part of that. And that's a great thing. But how do we address those dual goals of commemoration and interpretation? I guess I don't have an answer, but.
Right. One final comment or question, Barbara?
I thought I'd just jump on that and the things some other people had said. It seems to me that, part of what's confusing is what Annette said about people go into the beautifully restored slave quarters and say, gee, they had nice wood floors and those beautiful quilts, or, it's easy to say it wasn't so bad. Well, of course, what was so bad about slavery wasn't primarily that the houses were too small. That what slavery was is not just present in slave housing or in the fields, it's present in the big white house too. And it strikes me that the question of creating narratives and interpretation is so critical that it be recognized that all the structures in America are structures related to slavery, if they come north and south from a certain time period, and indeed after, that the connection is not just beyond commemoration, where we certainly commemorate Jefferson, and the question is how do you commemorate him a little less and interpret him a little more for people who just want to commemorate. It strikes me that one step to go beyond the issue of just slavery is we all still live in a world where the question is who does the work and who gets to sit in the nice house and play the violin. And that's not settled. That's not generations ago. And it strikes me one of the big challenges is when people come to the big house, they to make sure that they understand this is an artifact of slavery. This is African American people's lives here. The fact that they are not just sitting, it's not just when they're in their house that they are to be honored or remembered or seen. And the big house with all those beautiful artifacts and glasses of wine, that's an artifact of slavery too. If we could see slavery as a relationship and not just as different ways people were allowed to live, as if the big problem is some people's houses are bigger than others. Although I do think everyone should have nice houses. That's not the essence of what, there's a relationship between these houses and this house, between these people and this people, and that's getting that to be visible when your primary artifacts are houses, I think, is really important.
I would like to conclude, as it's 3 o'clock, by thanking our panelists as well as all of you for raising issues to something clearly to which there is much passion, much thought, and a great deal of some divergence in understanding of how and what to do in this context. So thank you all very much.